In 2012, I went with two friends to a random Giants game on a Tuesday night. The Giants were playing the Astros, who then were one of the worst teams in baseball. I guess they weren't cheating then. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Matt Cain was pitching, and as the game went on, I realized that something remarkable was happening. By the third inning, it dawned on me that the Astros hadn't gotten anyone on base. I was watching a perfect game unfold before my eyes. For those of you who aren't baseball fans, a perfect game is when a pitcher succeeds in not letting a single hitter from the other team on base. These are very, very rare. The one I saw was the 22nd perfect game in what up to then was 143 years of Major League Baseball. As I looked on from the upper deck, I noticed that people around me were acting kind of funny. The man in front of me was with 3 small children, but he insisted on holding the same child for the whole game. I think he thought it was a good luck omen. My friends and I definitely knew what was going on. I think we're good baseball fans, but we didn't say a word about it. We didn't want to jinx it. There was this one incredible defensive play by outfield Gregor Blanco that saved the perfect game that I will remember for the rest of my life. As you can tell, I love talking about this perfect game. It was definitely the best sporting moment in my life. I got to nerd out about this perfect game recently because I gave a presentation to the San Francisco Giants organization on Passover. This was part of a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative the organization is doing for its employees. On top of thinking about the perfect game, having to do this spiel on Passover got me thinking about what Passover is actually all about. As some of you probably know, Passover is the most celebrated Jewish holiday. Even Jews who don't come to shul on high holidays often celebrate Passover. And many non-Jews have been guests at a Seder. My presentation on Passover for the Giants got me wondering, why is this? Why is Passover so popular? Surely a huge part of the appeal of Passover is that it offers a wonderful reason to gather together with family and friends over a traditional meal. Sure enough, after I gave my little spiel on Passover, a handful of Giants employees shared their own stories of Passover and how important it was for them and their families. One of them talked about looking for the afikomen as a kid. Another one talked about the burden of having to do the 4 questions as the youngest kid in his family. And another one talked about the not-so-fun tradition of having to wait very hungrily for the full length of a traditional Seder. As I considered the popularity of Passover, I also thought about the content of the story we tell in our Seders. The story's message of liberation from oppression has resonated with Jews and non-Jews alike across the centuries. In order to emphasize this in my presentation, I began with a photo of a Seder at the Obama White House. The Passover message has inspired many people. Jews throughout the ages have applied the story of freedom to themselves when they have suffered from the hatred of others. The story of Exodus has also offered hope to other oppressed people throughout time. There is a reason many of the Bibles given to enslaved people in the United States omitted the story of the Exodus. The story of the Exodus is compelling to the oppressed and dangerous for the pharaohs of history. And so, as I prepared my presentation for the Giants, I found myself gravitating to one verse in particular in Exodus. It says, I'll read it first in English. It says, "You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the life of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt. Ve'ger lo tilchatz, ve'atem yadatem et nefesh hager, ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim." This verse encapsulates so well one of the central reasons we retell the story of the Exodus every Passover. The story reminds us to have compassion for everyone who suffers. Retelling the legend of our forebears who were freed from oppression and made it to freedom inspires us to work for the liberation of anyone who finds themselves in a Mitzrayim in Egypt, which literally means the narrow place. This year, Rabbi Shai Held, the president of the Hadar Institute in New York, wrote in the New York Times an article, a wonderful article that some of you may have seen. He talked about how Passover's radical message of advocating for freedom for the oppressed is more needed than ever. He wrote, "To tell the story of our past is always also to internalize an ethical injunction for our present and our future, to love the strangers, for we know that what it feels like to be a stranger. We know the vulnerability, the anxiety, and the loneliness, having ourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt." As we think through what it means to have compassion for those who are oppressed, I want to return to the verse I just quoted just now. The verse tells us not to oppress the stranger because we know the life of the stranger since we were strangers in Egypt. The words I just translated as the life of the stranger in Hebrew are nefesh hager. When we read this from a Torah scroll without vowels, this looks exactly like nefesh Hagar, the life of Hagar, the character from Genesis. Hagar was an Egyptian slave to Sarah, whom Sarah gave to her husband Abraham when Sarah could not conceive children. Abraham and Hagar together had the child Ishmael. As my description of her as a slave indicates, Hagar was mistreated and oppressed in Abraham and Sarah's household. And the closeness of her name to the name Hagar to the Hebrew word Hager, the stranger, is not an accident. Hagar is an ethnic outsider in this household. After Sarah gives birth to Isaac, Sarah dislikes Hagar and Ishmael and convinces Abraham to banish them. Abraham sends Hagar and young Ishmael out into the wilderness with a small amount of bread and water. There's this incredible, poignant, and heartbreaking moment when they're out in the desert suffering with little water and food, when Hagar separates herself from Ishmael because she thinks they're both going to die and she doesn't want to be around her son and watch him die. She says, "Let me not look at the child when he dies." And she sits far from him and bursts into tears. But miraculously, God hears Hagar's cries and sends a messenger to talk to Hagar. Then something remarkable happens. The Torah tells us that God opens Hagar's eyes and she sees a well of water in front of her. Hagar and Ishmael survive, and Ishmael becomes the patriarch of a whole people himself. The story of Hagar is similar to the story of the Exodus. We have an oppressed outsider, or a group of outsiders, whose cry God heeds and to whom God provides redemption. This year, as we recount the story of Passover, the linguistic connection between Hagar, the stranger, and Hagar, the character, seems especially important. Adding the story of Hagar to this year's Passover conversation reminds us that our tradition asks us to treat with compassion the oppressed, and even if they appear to be from an opposing group. And I'll also add that it's remarkable that God speaks to Hagar. God doesn't speak to very many characters in the Bible, but God goes out of God's way to save Hagar, this disenfranchised, oppressed person. The interplay between Hagar and Hagar gets convoluted. In Genesis, Hagar is oppressed because she's an Egyptian. Later, the Egyptians oppressed the people Israel. We are told to remember that we were strangers in the land of Egypt in a way that evokes Hagar, who herself is an Egyptian. This Hagar-Hagar interplay can remind us that all people fundamentally deserve to be free, whatever their Mitzrayim, their narrow place may be. Passover is a time to redouble our efforts to fight for liberation, the liberation of anyone who finds themselves to be constricted. This all reminds me of one of my favorite verses in the whole Tanakh. It's from Psalms. Min hametzar karatiya, anani bamerhavya. I translate it as, from the narrows I called to Adonai. Adonai answered me and brought me to the expanse. Our tradition teaches that history answered the people Israel with this message of freedom during the story of Exodus. And our tradition teaches that we are to see that Hagar, the stranger, are also to be blessed with freedom. As we celebrate the last days of Passover, which is also called Zman Hirutenu, the time of our freedom, we pray also for the freedom of all those who are in their own Mitzrayim. May the season bring liberation to us all.